The sun had barely risen over the vast plains of Montana, yet the ranch was already awake, though not alive. The wind whispered through brittle grass, carrying the smell of dust and old hay. For Caleb Ward, mornings had lost their meaning long ago. Once he used to greet the dawn with the hopeful energy of a man building a legacy. Now he moved through his chores like a ghost. His life measured not by days, but by duties. The ranch had been in Caleb's family for generations, a proud stretch of land, dotted with cattle and framed by distant mountains. But time and hardship had taken their toll. A lingering drought had dried up 2 wells, the price of beef had fallen, and his hired hands had long since left for better prospects. What remained was a solitary man and a few dozen heads of cattle struggling to survive. Caleb's life was as barren as the earth he tilled. His wife, Anna, had left 5 years earlier, unable to bear the silence that had taken root between them after the doctor's words shattered their dreams. "I'm sorry, Mr. Ward. It's permanent. You can't have children." Those words still echoed in his memory like a cruel verdict. They had always dreamed of filling their home with laughter, of a son or daughter running barefoot across the fields. But when that dream withered, so did their marriage. Now the ranch house stood half empty, its walls adorned with faded photographs of a happier time. Dust settled on the piano Anna once played, and her favorite rocking chair sat motionless by the fireplace. Caleb had tried to bury the pain in hard work, mending fences, tending to sick calves, fixing the roof, anything that would keep his hands busy and his mind distracted. But no amount of labor could fill the void that infertility had carved inside him. Most nights, he sat on the porch with a cup of black coffee, staring into the horizon as the stars emerged one by one. He thought about what it meant to be a man when you could no longer build a family of your own. He had built barns, bred cattle, and endured storms. Yet deep down, he felt defeated by something invisible, something no amount of grit could fix. The townsfolk respected Caleb, but they pitied him too. In a place where family was everything, he was seen as an incomplete man. Whispers followed him in town, quiet but sharp enough to cut. "Poor Caleb," they'd say, "a good man but cursed." He never corrected them. Instead, he let the words settle like dust on his shoulders, too weary to shake them off. Yet beneath the silence and solitude, something stubborn still lived in him, a seed of decency that hadn't died with his dreams. He took in stray animals, repaired fences for neighbors without asking payment, and never turned away a traveler in need of water or rest. Though his heart had hardened, compassion still flickered within, small but unextinguished. That flicker was about to change everything. The weather had been turning restless that evening, clouds gathering low and dark, lightning flashing faintly on the horizon. Caleb had just finished securing the barn doors when he heard it. A faint rustling sound, like something moving among the haystacks. At first, he thought it was one of the barn cats, but then came a muffled cough, small and human. He froze, his instincts sharpened by years alone on the land. Slowly, lantern in hand, he approached the source of the sound. When the light reached the far corner of the barn, his breath caught. Huddled beneath a torn blanket, her face streaked with dirt and fear, was a young girl, barely more than a child. Her clothes were ragged, her hands bruised, and her eyes wide with panic. Caleb stood still, stunned. He had expected many things on his lonely ranch. Coyotes, rustlers, even drifters, but never this. He didn't know it yet. But that single moment, that quiet discovery in the middle of a storm, would awaken something in him long thought dead. It would challenge the silence he had accepted as life, and in saving her, he might just find a reason to save himself. The storm broke over the plains with a fury that night, rain drumming against the barn roof, thunder rolling like distant cannon fire. Caleb Ward stood at the entrance, lantern trembling in his hand as lightning illuminated the frightened face of the girl crouched in the shadows. Her thin body shivered under a filthy blanket soaked through from the rain. She looked more like a ghost than a living child. For a moment, neither spoke. The air between them was filled only with the sound of wind and the restless stamping of horses. Caleb lowered the lantern slightly so the light wouldn't blind her. "Hey now," he said softly, his voice rough from disuse. "I ain't gonna hurt you." The girl flinched at the sound. She pressed herself back into the haystack, her eyes darting toward the open door as if expecting someone to burst in at any moment. Caleb saw the terror in her expression. Not just fear of him, but fear of something that had chased her here. He slowly set the lantern on a barrel and knelt down to her level. "What's your name?" he asked. No answer. She just shook her head, clutching the blanket tighter. Her hands were blistered and raw, her nails broken. Caleb noticed a bruise on her arm, half hidden by dirt. His jaw tightened. Whoever this girl was, someone had hurt her. And recently. "You're freezing," he said after a moment. "You'll catch your death sitting there." He stood and fetched an old wool coat hanging by the stall door. When he draped it over her shoulders, she recoiled, trembling as though expecting a blow. Caleb froze again, realizing how deep her fear ran. He took a step back, giving her space. "You can stay the night in here if you want," he said quietly. "There's a cot in the tack room. Warm, dry. I'll bring some food." He turned to leave, not expecting her to respond, but as he reached the door, a weak, hoarse voice stopped him. "Please, don't tell them I'm here." Caleb turned back. The girl's eyes glistened with desperation. "Who's them?" he asked. She hesitated, then whispered, "The men at the farm. They'll take me back." "They always do." The words hit him like a stone. He'd heard rumors, whispers of a nearby landowner who hired children to work long hours in the fields for scraps of food and a cot in the barn. He'd dismissed it as gossip. But now, looking at this trembling child before him, he saw the truth in her bruises. "What's your name?" he asked again, softer this time. "Lila," she whispered. "Lila Monroe." "All right, Lila," he said, testing the name as if it were something fragile. "You're safe here. No one's gonna hurt you tonight." She looked at him for a long moment, searching his face for deceit. Finding none, she finally nodded, still wary but too exhausted to resist. Caleb left briefly and returned with a plate of cornbread and a tin mug of milk. Lila devoured the food like someone who hadn't eaten in days. When she finished, her eyelids grew heavy, and she fell asleep before she could even thank him. Caleb stood there for a while, watching the rise and fall of her chest. She looked so small, too young to have known such suffering. As thunder cracked outside, Caleb leaned against the stall gate, his thoughts swirling. He had lived years without purpose, content to let his world shrink to the size of his ranch. But now something had shifted. The sight of this girl stirred an ache in him, one he thought had died with his dreams of fatherhood. He spent the night in a chair outside the tack room, rifle resting across his knees, listening to the storm fade. He didn't know what trouble she carried with her or what laws he might be breaking by sheltering her. But he knew one thing with certainty. Whoever had hurt this child would not find her here. When dawn finally broke, the first light of morning filtered through the cracks in the barn walls. Caleb rose stiffly and looked inside the tack room. Lila still slept, curled up in his old coat. For the first time in years, the silence on the ranch didn't feel empty. It felt like the beginning of something fragile, something dangerous, and something that might just bring his heart back to life. The next few mornings passed quietly, though the ranch seemed somehow changed. The air carried a different rhythm, the kind that comes when one heart begins to beat beside another after too long in silence. Lila stayed mostly indoors at first, speaking little, watching everything. Caleb could feel her caution in the way she moved, careful, small, as if afraid to take up space. He didn't press her with questions. He simply went about his chores, giving her time to breathe. The girl had been through something terrible. That much was plain. And he knew from experience that some wounds needed silence more than sympathy. Still, her presence stirred something restless inside him. Every time he saw her sitting by the window, staring at the endless sweep of the plains, he was pulled back to the ghosts of his own past. He remembered Anna, her soft laughter echoing through these same rooms, her gentle hands brushing flour from her apron as she spoke of the family they would build. He remembered her joy when they first married, the way she dreamed aloud of teaching their future children to ride, to read, to pray. Then came the years of waiting, and disappointment turned to quiet despair. Doctor visits, herbal remedies, whispered prayers. None had changed the verdict. "I'm sorry, Caleb, it's permanent." That single sentence had hollowed out his world. Anna had tried to be strong, but hope had died slowly between them. He still remembered the night she packed her suitcase. She hadn't shouted or wept, just whispered, "I can't live like this anymore." And she had gone, leaving behind a man who didn't know how to fix what life had broken. Now, watching Lila pick at her food, he felt a haunting sense of déjà vu, another fragile soul sitting in the shadow of loss. But unlike Anna, this girl wasn't walking away. She was clinging to survival. One afternoon, as rain pattered gently on the tin roof, Caleb found her standing by the horse corral, staring at the animals. He approached slowly. "You like horses?" he asked. She nodded. "They don't talk, but they listen." Caleb smiled faintly. "That they do." It was the first real conversation they'd had. He saw, just for a moment, a spark in her eyes, a child's wonder breaking through fear. She reached out to stroke the mane of his old mare, Belle, who stood patiently, nuzzling her hand. "She's beautiful," Lila whispered. "She's been here longer than most folks I know," Caleb said. "Gentle as they come. You can ride her once you're ready." The girl's face lit up briefly before fading back to caution. "I used to help with horses at the farm, but they weren't treated right." Her voice trembled on the last word, and Caleb felt anger rise in his chest. Not at her, but at whoever had made her afraid to speak. "You don't have to talk about it," he said gently. "Not till you're ready." She nodded again, grateful for his patience. That night, as he sat by the fire, the silence between them felt different, no longer heavy, but healing. Lila sat across from him, wrapped in a blanket, her eyes reflecting the firelight. He could almost imagine she belonged there, like a daughter who'd always been part of his home. But that thought frightened him too. He'd spent years convincing himself he wasn't meant to be a father, that life had closed that door forever. Now here was this girl, fragile, wounded, and unknowingly unlocking something deep within him. He looked into the flames and whispered a prayer he hadn't said in years, not for himself, but for her. For the strength to protect her, for the courage to not fail her as he had failed before. Outside, the rain turned to mist, and dawn began to color the horizon. In that quiet hour, Caleb realized something profound. The ranch wasn't the only thing that had been barren all these years. His heart had been too. And maybe, just maybe, this broken child was the seed that would bring it back to life. The weeks that followed slipped into a gentle rhythm, one that Caleb Ward had not known in years. The ranch, once silent except for the lowing of cattle and the creak of wind through dry wood, began to breathe again. Lila had quietly woven herself into the fabric of his days, as naturally as sunrise over the prairie. At first, she had been hesitant, hovering on the edges of chores, unsure if she was truly allowed to belong. But Caleb, patient and steady, gave her small tasks, collecting eggs, sweeping the porch, helping men tack in the barn. With every completed chore, she seemed to regain a small piece of herself. Caleb watched her grow stronger. Her thin frame began to fill out. Her cheeks lost their pallor, and her eyes, once haunted, now held a quiet determination. She was still cautious, still wary of sudden movements or loud voices, but her laughter, rare and fleeting, had begun to echo faintly through the house. It startled him the first time he heard it, not because it was loud, but because it felt like something sacred, something that didn't belong in a place so long accustomed to grief. One crisp morning, while fixing a broken fence, Caleb found Lila standing nearby, a hammer in one hand and a crooked grin on her face. "You're holding that thing like you plan to fight someone with it," he teased. She shrugged. "Maybe I am. The nails don't listen unless you scare 'em a little." Caleb laughed, and she smiled wider, the kind of smile that warmed even the coldest corners of his heart. "All right then," he said. "Let's scare some nails together." They worked side by side until the fence stood firm again. When they finished, she looked over the open land with a quiet pride that made Caleb's throat tighten. "You did good," he said simply. She turned to him and asked softly, "Why are you helping me?" The question caught him off guard. He thought for a moment before answering. "Because someone should have a chance to help you. Seems like no one's tried before." She stared at him, her eyes glistening. "People only help if they want something." "Then maybe I'm the exception," he replied. "All I want is to see you safe." Lila didn't respond, but something in her expression changed, a fragile trust, hesitant, yet real. As days turned into weeks, their connection deepened. Lila started joining him on horseback rides across the property, learning how to guide the animals gently instead of commanding them with fear. She had an instinct for it, a natural understanding of creatures that had known pain. Belle, Caleb's old mare, followed her like a loyal dog. Watching her ride across the fields, wind whipping her hair, Caleb felt something bloom inside him, a mix of pride, protectiveness, and joy. It was a feeling he had long ago accepted he would never experience. The tender ache of a father watching his child find freedom. At night, they often shared quiet meals by the fire. Lila would sometimes hum softly, a tune she said her mother used to sing before she was taken to work. Caleb never pressed her for details. He understood that the past would surface in its own time, like seeds sprouting after a storm. But with every passing day, the line between guardian and father blurred. When she smiled at him, it filled the emptiness Anna's departure had left behind. When she worried about his long hours in the cold, it reminded him that someone cared if he lived or died. He began to realize something profound. He had not rescued Lila just to protect her. She had rescued him too. Her presence had awakened a buried instinct, a forgotten tenderness he thought life had burned out of him. And yet, beneath that fragile peace, a quiet fear lingered. Caleb knew the world had rules, and fate had a cruel way of punishing those who dared to find joy in broken places. He didn't yet know how much trouble would come from sheltering her, or how far he would go to keep her safe. For now, though, he allowed himself the small mercy of hope. As the sun dipped behind the hills and Lila's laughter echoed faintly across the fields, Caleb whispered to himself, almost a prayer, "Maybe this is what being a father feels like." The peace that had settled over the ranch was fragile, so delicate that even the wind seemed afraid to disturb it. For months, Caleb Ward and Lila had built an unspoken rhythm together, rising at dawn, tending to animals, fixing fences, sharing quiet dinners by the fire. It was a simple life, but for both of them, it felt like a rebirth. Then, one cold afternoon, everything changed. Caleb was in the barn repairing a saddle strap when he heard the sound of engines, 2 vehicles pulling up the dirt road. He wiped his hands on his jeans and stepped outside, squinting into the sunlight. A county sheriff's truck stopped near the porch, followed by a government-issued sedan. The sight immediately sent a prickle down his spine. Visitors were rare on his land, and men in uniform rarer still. The sheriff climbed out first. Sheriff Dean Harker, an old acquaintance. He was a broad man with a lined face and the wary politeness of someone carrying bad news. Beside him stepped a younger woman in a neat gray coat holding a clipboard. She introduced herself as Ms. Howard, a representative from Child Protective Services. "Afternoon, Caleb," Harker began, tipping his hat. "We got a report about a missing girl. Might have been seen out this way. Thought we'd come by and ask a few questions." Caleb's jaw tightened. He felt a flicker of anger and fear. "You're welcome to ask," he said evenly, "but you won't find any trouble here." The woman gave a professional smile. "We're not here to accuse anyone, Mr. Ward. We just need to confirm the safety of a minor named Lila Monroe. She's been missing for several months. Some locals think she might have been taken against her will." The words "taken against her will" stung him like a slap. He wanted to laugh at the irony. That poor girl hadn't been taken. She'd been set free. But he knew how these things looked from the outside. An older man living alone, a teenage girl under his roof, no legal papers, no witnesses. "She's inside," Caleb said finally, "and she's safe. You can see for yourself." Lila had been watching from the kitchen window. When she saw the badges, panic flooded her face. By the time the sheriff entered, she was trembling, pressed against the wall, her eyes wild with terror. Ms. Howard approached gently. "It's all right, sweetheart. We're here to help." "No!" Lila cried. "You'll take me back. I'm not going back." Her voice cracked with fear. She tried to run toward the back door, but Caleb caught her by the shoulders, his voice calm but firm. "Easy now, Lila. Nobody's taking you anywhere. Not unless we know what's right." The sheriff glanced between them, uneasy. "Caleb, what's going on here?" Caleb met his eyes steadily. "She came here half dead, Dean. Beaten, hungry, scared. I gave her food and a place to rest. That's all. You think I'd harm her? You know me better than that." Harker hesitated, looking at Lila's face. The bruises, the calloused hands, the fear that didn't come from Caleb, but from somewhere else entirely. He sighed. "I know you, Caleb, but rules are rules. We gotta report back." Ms. Howard knelt beside Lila, speaking softly. "Do you want to stay here, or do you want to come with us?" Lila looked up at Caleb, the man who had saved her when no one else cared. "I want to stay," she whispered. "He's the only one who's ever helped me." The room fell silent. Even the sheriff looked moved. Ms. Howard made a note on her clipboard. "We'll need to verify his guardianship status," she said. "Until then, no one takes her." When they finally drove away, Caleb stood on the porch watching the dust trail fade. He felt both relief and dread. The law now knew about Lila. That meant protection, but it also meant exposure. That night, as he tucked a blanket around her shoulders, Lila whispered, "You won't let them send me back, will you?" Caleb looked at her, the girl who had brought warmth back into his cold world, and his voice was steady when he answered. "No, Lila, not while I'm breathing." But deep down, he knew that promise would soon be tested by the law, by the town, and by the very past that had driven her to his door. In the days that followed the visit from the sheriff and the social worker, a cautious peace settled back over the ranch. But it was peace of the uneasy kind, fragile as glass. Caleb Ward knew that from now on, eyes would be watching. The county knew Lila was there. The whispers in town would grow, and rumors had a way of twisting even the purest truth into scandal. Still, life went on. There were fences to mend, animals to feed, and a barn roof that needed patching before the spring rains came. Lila, eager to prove she wasn't a burden, threw herself into work with quiet determination. She woke before sunrise, helped with the morning feed, and even learned to milk the old cow that had long since given Caleb trouble. Her hands were small but strong, her movements deliberate. Sometimes she hummed softly as she worked, and though the sound was faint, it carried through the ranch like sunlight through dusty glass. Caleb watched her from a distance, proud but cautious. She was beginning to heal, and he knew better than to rush healing. The townspeople, however, were less forgiving. When Caleb rode into town for supplies, he could feel their stares like needles on his back. The storekeeper's wife, a thin woman with sharp eyes, whispered to another customer as he passed. "That's the Ward man, the one keeping that girl." He pretended not to hear, but the words followed him out the door. He'd lived most of his life by a quiet code. Work hard, mind your business, hurt no one. But small towns loved a story, especially one that smelled like sin. That evening, as he unloaded feed from the truck, he caught Lila watching him, concern written on her face. "They're talking about me, aren't they?" she asked softly. Caleb paused. "People talk about what they don't understand," he said, setting down the sack. "Let 'em. Truth has a way of outlasting lies. But what if they make you look bad? What if they take me away?" He sighed, wiping sweat from his brow. "Then we tell the truth louder than they tell their gossip." For a long moment, Lila was quiet. Then she nodded, determination flickering in her eyes. "I'll help. I'll work hard and they'll see I belong here." And she did. She learned quickly how to mend saddles, drive the old tractor, and manage the ranch's books in the evenings when Caleb's eyes grew tired. She had a head for numbers, and her handwriting, though neat and small, carried a surprising confidence. Caleb began taking her with him to the market on Saturdays. The first time she stepped out of the truck, whispers followed her like shadows. But when she stood beside Caleb at the cattle auction, calm and composed, people noticed something different. She wasn't a frightened girl anymore. She was part of his life, part of his work, part of his home. Some folks softened, others stayed suspicious, but Lila didn't let it show. She faced every glance with quiet dignity, as if she knew she had already survived worse than their judgment. At night, they sat on the porch, watching the horizon fade into starlight. Caleb sometimes told stories about the land, how his grandfather had broken the first horses, how the floods of '83 nearly wiped out the cattle herd, how the land always found a way to recover. Lila listened closely, eyes wide, soaking in every word. "You love this place," she said one evening. He nodded. "It's all I ever had." "And now it has me," she said, half smiling. Her words caught him off guard, simple, innocent, but powerful. He realized then that she didn't just see the ranch as her refuge. She saw it as home. And in that moment, he felt something shift deep inside him, a quiet sense of rightness, fragile but real, yet Caleb couldn't ignore the faint unease that lingered. He knew peace couldn't last forever. People like Mr. Hensley, the man who had once controlled Lila's life, didn't let go of power easily. Sooner or later, he would come looking. For his property, for revenge, or for silence. But for now, under the fading light of a Montana sky, Caleb chose to believe in small mercies. The girl he had rescued from fear now laughed beside him. The land he had nearly given up on was green again. And for the first time in years, the ranch felt alive, not just with work, but with hope. He told himself it would be enough. He didn't yet know how wrong he was. Spring came early that year, painting the Montana fields in gold and green. The cattle grazed lazily under a wide, forgiving sky, and for a while Caleb Ward allowed himself to believe that the worst was behind them. Lila was thriving, her laughter no longer hesitant, her eyes bright with the spark of youth. Together, they'd repaired the barn roof, sold a good season's worth of calves, and even planted a small vegetable garden behind the house. But peace, as Caleb knew too well, was never permanent. It began with the letter. He found it one morning tucked under the front gate. No stamp, no return address, just his name written in bold, uneven handwriting. Inside was a single sheet of paper with 5 words scrawled in red ink. "She belongs to me, Ward." His stomach turned to stone. He didn't need to guess who it was from. Earl Hensley, the wealthy landowner who ran the neighboring property where Lila had been enslaved, had finally come looking. For days, Caleb tried to hide the letter from Lila, but she sensed something was wrong. He became quieter, more watchful. His eyes lingered longer on the road, his hand never far from the rifle that hung by the door. When she finally confronted him, her voice trembled. "He's coming, isn't he?" Caleb exhaled slowly, meeting her gaze. "Maybe, but if he does, he won't take you." Her face went pale. "You don't understand, Caleb. He has friends, people in town, people with money. He'll make them believe I'm lying." Caleb's jaw tightened. "Then we'll fight harder. I ain't letting him or anyone else hurt you again." That night, a storm rolled over the plains. Thunder rattled the windows, and in the flicker of lightning, Caleb thought he saw the silhouette of a man on horseback near the tree line. He stepped out onto the porch, rifle in hand, but when the next flash came, the figure was gone. Still, he didn't sleep that night. Neither did Lila. The next day, the law came again, this time with papers. Sheriff Harker arrived with a folded document and a heavy look on his face. "I don't like this any more than you do, Caleb," he said, "but Hensley's filed for guardianship. Claims he's her legal custodian. He's got some kind of document signed years back." "Forged," Caleb spat. "You know damn well that man's been using kids like slaves." Harker nodded, uncomfortable. "Maybe so, but without proof, my hands are tied. The law don't always favor what's right, just what's written." Lila stood behind Caleb, trembling. "I'm not going back," she whispered. "I'd rather die than go back." The sheriff looked away, shame flickering in his eyes. "We've got a hearing in a week. Till then, stay put. But be careful. Hensley's been stirring trouble in town. Folks are saying ugly things." Ugly things was an understatement. Within days, rumors spread like wildfire that Caleb had kidnapped a runaway girl, that he'd been keeping her for himself. Some whispered that he was hiding her for money. Others said it was worse. When Caleb rode into town that week, no one met his eyes. The storekeeper's wife refused to serve him. Even old friends kept their distance. The isolation that once brought him peace now felt like a noose tightening around his neck. But through it all, Lila refused to hide in shame. She continued to work the ranch, holding her head high. "If we act guilty, they'll think we are," she said. Caleb admired her courage, though he feared it might draw danger faster. And his fear proved right. One evening, as the sun dipped low, a truck pulled up near the ranch fence. Earl Hensley stepped out, tall, broad, wearing a smirk that made Caleb's blood boil. "Afternoon, Ward," he called out. "I've come to collect what's mine." Lila froze beside the barn, her face drained of color. Caleb stepped forward, his voice calm but deadly firm. "She's not yours, Hensley." "She never was." Earl laughed, a cold, hollow sound. "We'll see what the judge says. Enjoy your little fantasy while it lasts." He turned and drove off, dust rising behind his truck like a warning. As the rumble faded, Caleb looked at Lila, who was trembling but defiant. He placed a steady hand on her shoulder. "We'll fight this," he said quietly. "No matter what it costs." Neither of them knew then just how high that cost would be, or how far Earl Hensley would go to destroy them both. The past had found them, and this time, it wasn't going to let go without a fight. The week leading up to the hearing was like living under a tightening storm cloud. Every day, Caleb Ward felt the pressure build, in town, in the whispers, in the air itself. Lila tried to stay strong, but the fear was never far behind her eyes. She barely slept, waking at every sound outside, half expecting to see Earl Hensley's truck parked at the gate again. Caleb did his best to shield her, though the weight of what was coming gnawed at him. Hensley was powerful. Money, land, and the kind of influence that bent local officials like dry grass. Caleb was just a worn-out rancher with little more than his word. But he had something Hensley didn't: truth, and a promise he refused to break. The morning of the hearing arrived gray and cold. They drove to the county courthouse in silence, the truck rumbling over the dirt road. Lila stared out the window, her hands clenched in her lap. "What if they believe him?" she whispered. "Then we appeal," Caleb said, though he wasn't sure how. "And if that don't work, we start again somewhere else." She looked at him, eyes wide. "You'd leave your ranch?" He nodded. "A ranch can be rebuilt." "You can't." Inside the courthouse, the air smelled of dust and paper. Hensley was already there, dressed sharp, his smirk confident. He had a lawyer beside him, young, polished, and sneering. Lila refused to look at him, but Caleb felt her trembling beside him. The proceedings were quick, clinical, and painfully unfair. Hensley's lawyer presented forged papers showing supposed guardianship, complete with signatures and dates. Caleb argued that the documents were fake, that Lila had been forced to work for Hensley under threat and abuse. But without witnesses or proof, his words were just wind against the law's walls. The judge, an older man who had shared whiskey with Hensley on more than one occasion, leaned back and sighed. "Mr. Ward, I see no legal standing for your claim." "The girl will remain in state custody pending further investigation," Lila gasped. "Please, don't send me back." The judge's eyes softened for a moment but stayed cold. "This is temporary. You'll be placed in protective care until matters are resolved." Protective care. Caleb knew what that meant. The system was overrun, careless. Kids like Lila disappeared into it, swallowed by bureaucracy. When they took her hand to lead her away, Lila cried out, reaching for Caleb. "Don't let them take me! Please, Caleb!" He tried to move toward her, but the bailiff stepped between them. His heart cracked at the sight, her small frame struggling against the officer's grip, her voice breaking in sobs. "Lila!" he shouted. "I'll get you back." I swear it! Her cry echoed through the hall long after she was gone. That night, the ranch felt colder than ever. Every sound was amplified. The wind through the eaves, the creak of the barn door, the silence where laughter once lived. Caleb sat by the fire with his head in his hands. For the first time in years, he wept openly. For her, for himself, for the cruel unfairness of it all. Days turned into weeks. He received no word from the state, only rumors that Hensley was pulling strings to have Lila returned to his farm as a ward of his care. The thought filled Caleb with rage so fierce it frightened even him. Then, one evening, as he stood staring out across his dark fields, headlights appeared on the distant road. A government car. The social worker stepped out, her expression grim. "There's been an incident," she said quietly. Lila spoke out. She told everything. She explained that Lila had broken her silence during a state interview, describing in vivid detail the beatings, the forced labor, the other children trapped at Hensley's farm. Her words had sparked an internal investigation. Caleb's knees nearly buckled with relief and fear. If Hensley learned she had spoken, he would lash out. That night, his fears proved right. Fire lit up the horizon. Flames rose from his barn, the heart of his ranch. Caleb ran into the blaze, shouting for his animals, choking on smoke. He saved what he could, but half his world turned to ash before the fire died. Standing amid the wreckage, sweat and soot streaking his face, Caleb whispered hoarsely, "You can burn my land, Hensley, but you won't break me, or her." He didn't know it then, but the fire would be the spark that changed everything, the moment when truth, finally, would begin to burn brighter than lies. The dawn after the fire painted the ranch in gray and ash. Smoke still curled from the blackened skeleton of the barn, the smell of char and loss hanging heavy in the air. Caleb Ward stood among the ruins, his boots sinking into the damp, scorched earth. The barn had been his pride, the heart of his life's work, and now it was gone, likely torched by Earl Hensley's men as a warning. But beneath the devastation, something else stirred in him, not despair but resolve. He had lost nearly everything before, his wife, his chance at fatherhood, and now his livelihood. But this time someone depended on him. Lila had trusted him, and he had sworn to protect her. He wasn't about to let fear or fire stop him. As he shoveled through the debris that morning, the sheriff's truck pulled into the yard. Sheriff Harker stepped out, his face grim but conflicted. "Heard about the fire," he said quietly. "You think it was Hensley?" Caleb didn't look up. "I don't think—" "I know," Harker sighed. "You got any proof?" Caleb threw down his shovel. "You know damn well I don't need proof to see his mark. The man's sending a message, to me and to her." The sheriff's gaze softened. "Lila's safe for now. The state moved her to a different facility last night, somewhere Hensley doesn't know about." Caleb froze. "You sure of that?" Harker nodded. "Far as I'm told, yeah. But you didn't hear that from me?" He paused, hesitating before adding, "There's talk about an investigation. The girl's testimony got the attention of state authorities. They're digging into Hensley's records, and it don't look good for him." It was the first real glimmer of hope in weeks. Caleb clung to it like a lifeline. "So she told them everything?" "She did," the sheriff said, almost admiringly. "Took guts for a kid like her to stand up to a man like him. But Ward," he looked at the burned barn, "you need to be careful. Hensley's desperate now. Desperate men do stupid things." When the sheriff drove off, Caleb stood alone again, staring at the smoldering ruins. He knew what had to be done. If the law couldn't move fast enough, he'd make sure the truth did. Over the next few days, Caleb gathered everything he could: photos, receipts, old letters, even scraps of gossip from townsfolk who once worked for Hensley. He visited the local paper, urging the young reporter to look deeper. "You want a real story?" he said, slapping a charred piece of Hensley's branding iron on the desk. "Start here. You'll find hell under that man's ranch." Meanwhile, miles away, Lila sat in a state shelter, clutching a worn flannel shirt Caleb had given her. She'd replayed the fire news in her mind, terrified that he might have been hurt. The social worker told her he was fine, but the fear lingered. Still, she didn't regret speaking out. She had carried her pain long enough. Now, she wanted justice, not just for herself, but for the other children Hensley had hurt. Her bravery sparked something she couldn't have imagined. State investigators raided Hensley's ranch. What they found made the front page of the Bozeman Herald. Local tycoon accused of illegal child labor and abuse. Photos of malnourished children, hidden bunkhouses, and falsified documents flooded the news. Caleb read the article standing outside the feed store, hands trembling. The whole town was buzzing, some in shock, others pretending they'd never known. Hensley was arrested that afternoon, his empire collapsing under the weight of exposure, but victory came at a price. Caleb knew Hensley wasn't the kind of man to surrender quietly. Rumors spread that he'd vowed revenge, that he'd find a way to make Ward and that girl pay. One night, as Caleb sat on his porch staring at the stars, a sound broke the silence, the distant growl of an engine. His muscles tensed, heart thudding. The sound grew closer, then faded, leaving only dust and fear in its wake. He realized then that even with Hensley behind bars, the danger wasn't over. There were others, men who had benefited from his cruelty, who would do anything to keep their secrets buried. But for the first time, Caleb didn't feel helpless. He felt purpose. The fire had taken his barn, but it had also burned away his hesitation. He wasn't just protecting Lila anymore. He was fighting for something bigger, for truth, for justice, for every life that man had crushed, and he wasn't done yet. Because as the ashes cooled on his land, Caleb made a vow, one that burned hotter than any fire. He would see this through, no matter what it cost him. 600 words. For a brief moment, it felt like justice had finally won. Earl Hensley was behind bars. The newspapers sang praises of Lila's bravery, and townsfolk who once avoided Caleb Ward now nodded to him in quiet respect. Investigators uncovered everything: the hidden quarters where children had been kept, the falsified records, the bribes to local officials. The truth was out. But peace, as Caleb knew, was a fragile thing, and it shattered just as quickly as it came. The first sign came one late afternoon when the phone rang. Caleb answered, expecting the sheriff. Instead, a deep, gravelly voice said, "You think this is over, old man? You ruined good men's lives." "There's a price for that." Then the line went dead. He stood there for a long time, the receiver trembling in his hand. It wasn't Hensley. He was still in county lockup awaiting trial. No, this was one of his men, one of those ranch hands who had turned a blind eye to Hensley's crimes because they profited from them. Caleb knew then that the battle wasn't finished. It had just changed shape. Meanwhile, Lila was moved again, this time to a foster home outside Helena. Though safer, she felt trapped in a world that didn't fit her. The other kids whispered about her story. Some pitied her, others mocked her for being the girl from the news. She missed the wide-open fields, the smell of hay, the quiet evenings on the porch beside Caleb. He was the only person who had ever made her feel safe. And now, she was miles away, watching her life unfold through headlines. Her social worker told her it was for her protection, but Lila wasn't convinced. She'd seen the kind of men Hensley employed, the kind who didn't stop until they got revenge. Every night she dreamed of fire and shadows moving toward the ranch. Back in Bozeman, the town's mood began to shift. People whispered that maybe Hensley wasn't as guilty as the papers claimed, that Caleb and the girl had exaggerated for attention. It was the same cowardly doubt that always followed truth. Hensley's lawyer started feeding the press stories of vengeful fabrications and unreliable witnesses. Caleb felt the weight of it in every glance, every cold shoulder. Still, he refused to be silenced. He attended every hearing, sitting in the back of the courtroom while Hensley smirked in his orange jumpsuit. When Hensley's eyes met his, there was no fear, only hatred. One evening, as Caleb locked up the house, he noticed something that made his stomach drop. Tire tracks near the back fence, fresh ones. He followed them with his lantern until they disappeared into the woods. Then he saw it, a broken fence post, and beside it, A dead calf. Its ear tag was missing. It wasn't theft. It was a message. He called the sheriff, but by the time Harker arrived, the evidence was gone. Whoever had done it was careful, too careful. "Could be kids," the sheriff said. Though his tone lacked conviction, Caleb could tell he was worried too. That night, sleep wouldn't come. He sat on the porch, rifle across his knees, eyes scanning the horizon. The wind howled through the valley like a warning. The next morning brought worse news. Lila's foster mother called, her voice shaking. Lila was gone. She'd vanished sometime during the night, leaving behind a note. "I can't hide anymore. I have to make this right." Caleb's heart stopped. He knew exactly what that meant. She was going after Hensley, or the people who still served him. He saddled his horse before sunrise, the old instinct of a protector kicking in. The road stretched endlessly ahead, every mile filled with the weight of dread. He stopped only once, at a gas station, where a young attendant said he'd seen a girl matching Lila's description boarding a bus heading north. By the time Caleb reached the next town, storm clouds were gathering over the plains. Thunder rolled like a warning drum. He prayed he wouldn't be too late. Because he knew Hensley's kind. Men who'd rather destroy everything than face justice. If they found Lila first, she wouldn't stand a chance. As lightning split the sky, Caleb drove harder, the headlights slicing through sheets of rain. His mind replayed her voice. "You saved me once, Caleb. I can save others." He realized then that she wasn't just running toward danger. She was running toward her own redemption. And he would move heaven and earth to bring her home again, even if it meant facing the demons he thought were buried for good. The storm raged across the Montana plains as Caleb Ward drove through the night, his truck's headlights cutting through the torrent like twin spears of light. Every few minutes, he checked the crumpled note from Lila again, the one she'd left behind at the foster home. Her handwriting was shaky but determined. "I can't keep hiding, Caleb. They're still out there, hurting others. I have to make this right." The words burned in his chest like a brand. She was brave, too brave, and still too young to understand the kind of danger she was walking into. He knew where she was headed, though. There was only one place that fit the pattern. The abandoned section of Hensley's old ranch, the part no one ever bothered to investigate thoroughly. He'd heard rumors, whispered stories that Hensley's operation extended deeper than anyone knew, that there were other men involved, men who had quietly vanished after the scandal broke. If Lila had gone there looking for proof, she'd walked right into the lion's den. Caleb pressed the gas pedal harder, the truck fishtailing briefly on the slick dirt road. His knuckles whitened around the steering wheel. He hadn't prayed in years, but tonight he found himself muttering broken pleas to the heavens. "Just keep her safe. Please, God, keep her safe." Hours later, he reached the outskirts of the Hensley property, the part that had been sealed off after the raid. The rain had slowed to a drizzle, and the world was eerily silent. The main house loomed ahead, dark and decaying. The old barn stood like ghosts against the mist. Caleb parked a mile away and approached on foot, rifle slung across his shoulder. His boots squelched in the mud, each step deliberate. When he reached the fence, he saw it. Small footprints in the wet soil. Lila's. They led toward the equipment shed. He found the door slightly ajar. Inside, the faint beam of a flashlight flickered. Relief flooded him. "Lila," he called softly. The light froze, then turned toward him. She was there, soaked, shivering, but alive. Her face lit up when she saw him. "Caleb!" He rushed forward, pulling her into a tight embrace. "What the hell were you thinking?" He whispered hoarsely. "I had to find proof," she said, holding up a weathered folder. "Records, names. He wasn't working alone, Caleb. There are others. Businessmen, ranch owners, people who paid him to keep quiet." Her voice trembled. "If we give this to the state, they can stop them all." Before Caleb could answer, a sound echoed outside, the crunch of boots on gravel. Then another. Lila's eyes widened. "They followed me." Caleb motioned for silence and doused the flashlight. Peering through a crack in the wall, he saw two figures moving through the rain. Armed men, their outlines familiar. Hensley's enforcers. Even with their boss behind bars, they were still cleaning up his mess. Caleb's heart pounded. "We need to move," he whispered. "Now!" They slipped out through the back, crouching low, the wet grass whispering under their feet. Lightning flashed, revealing the truck parked near the fence line. They were almost there when one of the men shouted, "There! By the barn!" Gunfire cracked through the night. Caleb grabbed Lila's hand and pulled her behind a tractor. Bullets tore through the air, sparking off metal. "Stay down," he hissed. Lila's breath came in sharp gasps. "They'll kill us." "Not if I can help it." Caleb returned fire, forcing the attackers to take cover. The storm's thunder mingled with the gunshots, creating a chaos of sound and light. When one of the men broke from cover, Caleb lunged, tackling him to the ground. The fight was brutal. Fists, mud, and rage. Caleb disarmed him and turned the weapon on the second man, who hesitated before fleeing into the darkness. Silence fell again, broken only by the rain. Caleb looked down at the beaten man, who groaned and spat blood. "Who sent you?" Caleb demanded. The man smirked through the pain. "You think Hensley's the only one? You're too late, old man. She's marked now. They'll come for her, too." Caleb's stomach turned cold. He knocked the man unconscious and turned to Lila. "We're leaving. Now." They fled into the night, the stolen documents clutched tightly in her arms. Behind them, the ranch loomed like a dying monster, its dark secrets finally clawing their way to the surface. As Caleb drove them away, Lila leaned against the window, tears mixing with rain. "I didn't mean to cause more trouble," she whispered. Caleb glanced at her, voice steady but filled with emotion. "You didn't, kid. You did what was right. Now we just have to finish it." Neither of them spoke for the rest of the drive. The storm passed, leaving behind only silence, the kind that comes before something far worse. Because deep down, Caleb knew this wasn't the end of their fight. It was just the beginning of the reckoning. The sun rose weak and pale over the Montana plains, washing the world in muted gold. Caleb Ward's truck rumbled down the long, empty road toward Bozeman, its tires kicking up mist from the wet asphalt. Beside him sat Lila, wrapped in a blanket, her eyes red from exhaustion. The stolen folder rested on her lap, the very thing they had risked their lives to recover. Inside it were names, dates, bank transfers, undeniable proof that Earl Hensley's operation had deep roots in the state's political and business circles. Caleb hadn't slept in nearly 2 days, but he couldn't rest. Not yet. He knew the men who'd attacked them wouldn't stop. The only way to keep Lila safe now was to make sure the truth went public, everywhere, fast. As they approached town, Lila finally spoke, her voice small but steady. "Do you think they'll believe it this time?" Caleb glanced at her. "They'll have to. This ain't rumor anymore. This is evidence." He parked outside the Bozeman Herald office, just as the editor, Martha Greeley, was arriving. She froze when she saw the pair, Caleb covered in dirt and bruises, Lila clutching the folder like it was her life. "Good Lord, Ward," Martha whispered. "What happened to you two?" "No time," Caleb said, handing her the documents. "You want the story of your career? It's in there. Publish it all. Names, records, everything, before they can bury it again." Martha scanned a few pages, her eyes widening. "If this is real, it's real," Caleb said firmly. "We've got the scars to prove it." Within hours, the newsroom was buzzing. Phones rang off the hook as reporters verified details, cross-checking bank data and testimonies. Lila sat quietly in the corner, watching as her pain transformed into something powerful, a weapon of truth. For the first time, she didn't feel like a victim. She felt like she mattered. By evening, the story broke across every major outlet in the state. Child labor ring linked to prominent officials, evidence exposes statewide cover-up. The fallout was immediate. Arrest warrants were issued. Officials who once sneered at Caleb now scrambled to save themselves. Protests erupted in nearby towns. And from his cell, Earl Hensley finally lost the smirk that had haunted both Caleb and Lila for months. But victory came with a cost. 2 nights later, as they lay low in a safe cabin provided by Sheriff Harker, a shadow moved outside the window. Caleb spotted it instantly, the glint of a rifle barrel in the moonlight. He threw himself toward Lila just as a shot shattered the glass. They hit the floor hard. Caleb returned fire, his pulse thundering in his ears. The sheriff's men rushed out and managed to corner the shooter, one of Hensley's loyal hands, desperate and half-crazed. He was arrested, but not before he shouted something that chilled Lila to her core. "You can't kill the roots. They'll just grow back." When the danger finally passed, Lila sat on the floor, shaking. Caleb knelt beside her, placing a rough, reassuring hand on her shoulder. "It's over," he said softly. "You did it, kid. You brought the truth out." She looked up at him, eyes glistening. "It doesn't feel over?" He nodded slowly. "Maybe not yet, but it's a start." Days later, the governor himself issued a public apology for the systemic failures that allowed Hensley's crimes to go unchecked. Survivors were promised protection, and Lila's testimony was sealed as the cornerstone of the state's largest trafficking prosecution. For Caleb, the victory was bittersweet. The ranch was gone, burned, blackened, but not forgotten. Yet something new had been built in its ashes. A bond, stronger than blood, forged in fire and truth. When he and Lila returned to the property weeks later, the land was quiet again. The spring grass had begun to grow where the barn once stood. Lila looked around, breathing in the clean air. "You're going to rebuild?" she asked. Caleb smiled faintly. "Yeah, but this time it won't just be a ranch. It'll be a home, for kids like you who need one." Tears welled in her eyes. "You mean, like a refuge?" He nodded. "A place where no one's ever going to use or hurt them again." As the morning sun rose higher, the two of them stood side by side, a broken man and a scarred girl, survivors of the same storm. The past would always leave its marks, but the future, that was theirs to shape. And for the first time in years, Caleb Ward believed in something he thought he'd lost forever: hope.